Ukraine has blamed Russia for taking control of one of its drones and steering it into Estonian airspace, where it was shot down by a NATO fighter jet. This is just the latest in a series of cross-border drone incidents that have caused political uproar in the Balkan states. Estonian police are still searching for the downed aircraft, which the country's military said had been shot down by a Romanian NATO jet on a training mission. Estonia's defence minister, Hanno Pevkur, said the drone was presumed to have been targeting Russian positions, and he outlined some of the conversations Baltic nations have been having with Ukraine.
We've said to the Ukrainians all the time that if you're attacking Russian positions or Russian targets, then these trajectories have to be as far from the NATO territory as possible. That doesn't mean that this is only Estonia or Latvia. It concerns also Poland, Lithuania, Finland, doesn't matter. The point is that these trajectories have to be so far away from the NATO territory as possible. We have not given our airspace to Ukrainian air forces. This is first, because I hear all the time that Russian propaganda is using that somehow that NATO territories, is it Latvia or is it Estonia or is it Finland, are giving our airspace for Ukrainians. We have not given that. And also, to be very clear, Ukrainians have not asked that.
Well, today, neighbouring Latvia also issued alerts about possible drone incursions. Latvia's government collapsed last week after drones hit an oil storage facility. The coalition fell apart amid infighting over the military's failure to intercept the drones. Ukraine says those devices were also diverted to Latvia by the Russian military. Well, our correspondent Teri Schultz in Brussels explained how this Ukrainian drone ended up in Estonian airspace.
I don't have any other information than what you have already discussed here. It is believed by these border countries that Russia is using electronic warfare to reprogram these drones and send them back into NATO airspace in an effort to divide NATO countries, to make them criticize Ukraine, which has happened. So it's actually quite cheap and quite effective at the moment. All of these leaders are forced to put out statements telling Ukraine this is unacceptable and it has to stop.
Well, NATO says the downing of the Ukrainian drone over Estonia shows that its air defences are working. But there have been occasions in recent weeks when that hasn't been the case, right?
Well, that's right. This is the first one that's been shot down in among the recent incidents. Of course, we had the Polish incursion of more than 20 drones that they did shoot down. But these missiles, which is the way that they're attacking the problem at the moment, are very expensive. So I would imagine that in the other cases, NATO, which scrambles the jets, simply made the decision that the drone was not a danger to people on the ground, and so they didn't want to use this very expensive way to counter it. They are working very hard at the moment on having electronic ways to counter the electronic warfare of Russia, so that, if Russia tries to zap a Ukrainian drone into NATO airspace, they zap it right out. Now, that's a very unscientific explanation, but these are certainly some of the things that they're working on right now.
Could these drone incursions on some level be a blessing for NATO members by identifying weaknesses in their air defences?
That's one way to look at it, as long as nobody's hurt on the ground, which is the big concern and which would indeed drive an even bigger wedge than public statements between the Allies and Ukraine. So there is certainly concern about the loss of life, and otherwise, absolutely, they're learning lessons every single day from the Ukrainians about this. At the same time, I think it is a bit puzzling that they haven't been able to counter this because, of course, Ukrainians are helping train NATO in tactics of Russian warfare. So I am personally just a bit surprised that they haven't been able to stop them. And this is why the statements keep coming out of Baltic and Finnish leaders saying this has to be stopped.
The Russian line is that these incursions show that Baltic countries are allowing Ukraine to use their airspace to launch attacks. Is there likely to be any truth in that?
That's a complete lie, for sure. And this is something that, Russia wants to use as a pretense so that it can say that NATO has entered the war. If these NATO countries were to allow Ukraine to launch attacks from their territory, the same as let personnel launch attacks from their territory, that would be a pretext for Russia to possibly attack NATO. That's absolutely not happening. I've asked myself of Baltic leaders, and the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, who just held a press conference this afternoon, from which I just came, had a pretty clever answer. He said, if we were launching these drones into Russia, we wouldn't be shooting them down.
Okay. Earlier this month, a Ukrainian sea drone full of explosives was discovered in Greek waters. And NATO has played down the threat from all these Ukrainian drone incidents. But do you think there is concern behind the scenes?
There's definitely concern. And in fact, at this press conference I just told you about, there were two questions about the Greek naval drone that was found laden with explosives. Of course, there's concern, because even if nobody blames Ukraine for putting it there, of course, there would be repercussions for Ukraine if people were hurt by these drones, and particularly by this armed drone. So I know there's a lot of concern. At the same time, as we have talked about this being a tactic by the Kremlin to hurt Ukraine, to weaken Ukraine's support in the West, I think that you're not going to hear NATO be critical openly of Ukraine. At the same time, behind the scenes, they must be trying to work with the Ukrainians, who have the best war-fighting forces in Europe, to try to figure out how they can stop these, because they truly are a danger to the publics here in NATO and European countries.
And what is Ukraine saying about these incursions by its drones?
They do say that they did not launch them here. You know, the number of drones being launched by Ukraine to counter the high number of drones launched by Russia is understandable. And in fact, I spoke with the Estonians over the weekend before this incident, and they said, we absolutely recognize Ukraine's right to defend itself. At the same time, we are concerned that this is happening. Ukrainians are understood to their launching of these drones toward Russia are understood. They're not going through NATO airspace on purpose, and nobody thinks they are. But at the same time, something has to be done. Public safety is at stake. So the Ukrainians are saying they didn't do it. They're blaming it on Russia. At the same time, if something happens, it certainly will not be a good thing for Ukraine.
Thanks, Teri. Teri Schultz in Brussels.